Two. Hey guys, today I am joined by Jim Zouch, a very good friend of mine, a very special guest. He's a performance physiotherapist, and today we're going to be looking at some of the background and his philosophies on how to heal people, healing the body after we've been damaged, after we've created too much chaos in our system. So Jim, thanks for coming on, mate.
Great to be here, man. Great to talk to you.
Do you want to give us a bit of a background in how you got into performance physio?
Yeah, it's a long background. It depends where I start. I mean, I started studying engineering straight out of uni, and I hated it. I lasted a year and quit. I went back and worked on my parents' farm for a year. I thought this probably isn't, where I want to end up in 10 years. And then studied science, and halfway through my science degree, I came across sports medicine. I had an amazing lecturer, which I completely forget her name now, but she was fantastic. From there, I developed a passion for sports medicine, and then I went into physiotherapy as a postgraduate degree, and that's how I got into physio to start with.
I guess it's like engineering. You went from engineering to engineering the body. Similar kind of
Yeah. I think maybe there's a bit of a common thread there. Initially, I liked trying to work out how the body works and the biomechanics, but I mean, I've probably moved a long way away from that now. That was kind of where my passion started, but I think it's now a bit more about the person and less about the biomechanics.
Interesting. And so the actual academic part, how many years did you train for?
I did it ended up being a 3.5 year undergraduate degree, or 4 year, I can't remember. But my last 6 months, I was in the University of Tennessee, where I did strength and conditioning, which was also a sort of one of the things that led me into physio. So I was in a class there with the then strength and conditioning coach for one of the University of Tennessee football teams. And he was a brilliant guy. Like, he was a jacked, bit of a meathead, but super intelligent guy. And I got a bit of a passion from him in terms of how the body works, how strength and conditioning training works. So I went from there, came back to Australia and did my Masters of Physio, which is like a graduate entry program. And that was 2 years, like an intense 2-year program. And in that, you do probably, from memory, 6 to 8 weeks of kind of placement. And that's sort of in your holidays, and the rest of the time you're studying and learning different parts of physiotherapy.
Awesome. And that set you up. So, and then how many years have you been practicing since then? So like in terms of actually in the field?
11 years now. And I've delved in and out of working with athletes. I was lucky enough at the start to work with the academy sport. So we have the AIS, which are our top institute. And below that, we have our state level athletes, which is essentially journeyman type athletes, the ones that are either on their way up or maybe on the fringe. So I got to work with some of those guys quite early with the rowing team, which was kind of my first introduction to sports. And then a few local football teams as well, which was kind of where I started. And then from there, sort of when I moved over to London, I got to see some more athletes just because of the clinic I worked at, we were exposed to that. But most of my time has really been spent with the average day human being, which is actually probably what I enjoy seeing more, to be honest with you.
Why is that?
I had a conversation with someone this a while ago. I think I see the appeal of working with elite athletes, right? They're like the kind of Ferrari of the car world. Like, it's pretty amazing, it's jazzy, it's all these kind of things. And not always, this is a very sweeping statement, but they tend to have a pretty good support team behind them. They're pretty driven individuals. I mean, you're an athlete. I had that athlete life. You're driven towards a goal. So I think getting them on task and achieving stuff is a little bit different to the average person who has pain, doesn't really know a lot about their body, is maybe not quite so driven, and has often a lot of other factors going on that sort of influence their kind of journey. And I find that's, I don't know, sometimes a little bit more rewarding. I'm not sure if I'm telling myself that because that's what I see, but I kind of enjoy seeing those patients and working out the problems and then seeing how we can kind of help their life out a little bit by, helping them through their pain journey.
Something a bit more holistic, maybe. Like, do you find the elite athletes harder work?
No, not necessarily harder. I think, and they can be. I mean, depending on the personality, right? There's a lot of A-type personalities out there that are quite demanding, but I think you can do quite adventurous stuff with athletes, which is really cool. Like, especially in terms of exercise prescriptions, you can really go high level and challenge them, which is great. But I think with the athlete, I almost expect with their kind of motivation, self-efficacy, a lot of the time they get better with, you don't need to push them too hard. They want to get better. You can kind of roughly guide them. Whereas, if I get an old 60-year-old farmer coming in with low back pain, who's been told all his life some really horrible myths from his wife and his friends about his back pain, it's a lot more challenging to try and turn them around and get them on board with what you're trying to do. Frustrating, but if you get there, I don't know, I get a real sense of satisfaction from work.
Quite interesting. It's like the power of belief, isn't it? Behind what sits behind, like what story are you telling yourself about your injury? I think that's a really interesting point you've made there, that obviously the athlete has got this story they're telling themselves about how great they're going to be, whereas the 60-year-old who's had back pain for the last 5 or 10 years has got a completely different set of narratives kind of going on. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It's huge. And I can't remember who I learned this off. It might have been after reading like a Louis Gifford book, who's a really amazing physiotherapist. But he used to ask, I think it was him who used to ask patients to draw what their problem was. So he'd say, how do you envisage your knee? What does it look like to you? And you get them to draw it. And I thought it was a bit kooky when I first heard of it. But a few of my patients that couldn't articulate their problems, you'd get them to kind of draw the issue. So you'd say, okay, draw to me what your hip looks like. And, it was really interesting. Like I had some guys who draw jagged edged hips, or I had a really interesting chap that had like a patellar tendinopathy, and he drew his left tendon, which was his non-injured tendon. And he drew this nice sort of straight line, striated tendon, which looked like something that come out of a biological textbook. And then his injured tendon, he drew this huge hole and in the middle of it. And I kind of quizzed him on it a little bit. And he goes, that's how I see my tendon, is this tendon with a huge hole. And it was because of that belief. He just wasn't happy to put any load through it. And he was a pretty motivated guy, but he just thought, if my tendon looks like that, why am I doing any exercise? So it was a pretty cool little process. It doesn't always work.
That is a really cool process. And I guess some of what you're trying to do, we'll go through like kind of the way you work through problem solving in a minute. But I guess some of what you're trying to do initially is you're trying to get the person, the human that you're interacting with in front of you, you're trying to get them on side to your chain of the way you understand the world, the way you understand the body. I guess some of your job, initially, when you bring somebody who's completely new into the room, is that you're trying to basically get them on side and get them to see the injury the same way that you see it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, to a certain degree. It depends on their beliefs. So if their beliefs, I fear, a little askew of what, is going on in their tissue or kind of the extent of the damage, then it's trying to reframe that a little bit so they have a bit more belief in the structure of the body. It's pretty powerful. You can get it wrong. I mean, people always talk about, reframing them and all those kind of things, or for helping the patient reframe the idea of their injury, but you can definitely get it wrong. So if it's the wrong time for the patient, or you maybe use the wrong words, and people look at you like you're crazy. I mean, when it works, it's amazing. It's incredible. I mean, I've had some neck patients who've had chronic neck pain. And again, I'd sort of ask them, what does your neck look like? And they draw this jagged line. Or for some people in a straight position, they draw their line. They draw it like the neck's sitting off to the side. And that's their personal impression of where their neck is. It's this neck that's constantly sitting like this, which doesn't fit with where their neck actually is. And I think some of that stuff's really cool to bring to the front and expose them to that and sort of challenge their belief a little bit, but it has to be done pretty subtly. And yeah, sometimes it goes wrong and people kind of think you're crazy and you don't see them again. They walk out. You put that one down to a bad experience, unfortunately.
I guess as well, like, do you, just a point on that, I guess you don't ever guarantee people a fix, but I guess from what I've understood about the body is that you've got this checklist and there's things that you're ticking off and you're working your way through in terms of what you suspect the problem to be, but what other things could be affecting it, because obviously the body's such a chaotic system and there's so many interconnected parts. I guess, like, what's your thoughts on, like, how do you guarantee the fix, or do you kind of give people a bit more?
No, and maybe I should, because I think your confidence, plays into the patient confidence a huge amount. Like I used to do, I mean, you probably saw me when I did loads of glute stuff, right? And I had this, and I've definitely moved on from there, but I had this huge confidence in getting hips moving and working on, what I thought was working on external rotators and all this kind of jazz, which I look back now and go, I was just way too, narrow focused. But I had the confidence it would work, and I'm sure that rubbed off on a lot of my patients. I just got them active and they were moving. And I put it down to this amazing technique I had at trying to get them to use certain muscles, but really I was probably just instilling confidence in them, getting them moving. They saw my confidence. But on the flip side, that can work against you. So if you've got someone that's pretty challenging and you don't have a lot of confidence in not just yourself, but in physiotherapy, I find myself at times going, I don't know, it really sounds really bad, but sometimes I think, how much can I offer this patient? Like, what, as a physiotherapist, can I do to help them out here? And I think they feel that, and then that sort of affects their improvement. Sometimes I refer them on to colleagues of mine who are super confident, and it doesn't matter their approach. I think just sometimes their confidence just boosts that patient up and gets them through a tough time.
I watched a thing with Darren Brown on Joe Rogan the other week, and it was like he was talking about the idea that obviously when people get hypnotized, it's all about this susceptibility. And I guess there's some crossover with obviously what you do, is that people come in and it's all the mind play, it's all the suggestion, sorry, not susceptibility, suggestion, and how suggestible the person is, and whether their openness to the treatment that you're going to basically be putting in place. And I guess there's obviously this huge crossover between the physical part and then obviously the mental part.
Huge. I mean, if you think about trust, right? Trust is a big issue. So a patient walks into a clinic, they're obviously in a lot of pain, pretty vulnerable, and they, it's like anything. They might have searched you on Google or something like that to find you, and they're not really quite sure how you're going to work with them, how well that's going to work. You might see a 4.5 star on Google and a few of those and go, great, I'll go and see that person. But, if that patient's been referred, let's say by a friend or a family member or a doctor that says, you must go and see that physio, immediately your ability to go into their trust and try and have an effective outcome, I think, is massively increased, because straight away they've given you some authority, like the friend or the referrer has given you some authority, and they're like, well, this person works, he must know what I'm talking about. There's less resistance to the process. Whereas if they've walked off the street or off Google, there's so much more convincing to be done in that initial consultation, just for them to, to show them your authenticity and show them that you care. Like, there's a much harder road to come across, but that's where it's difficult.
Interesting. And I guess that's where like the referrals for you play a big role, isn't it? Obviously it's that whole like word of mouth passed around in groups of people. You do one good job for a person, and you're kind of then seen in obviously I know this, obviously I've been treated by you, so it's kind of the idea that once you've done one good job, then people become your referral kind of based, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, you used to refer me clients, right? And you'd say, go and see Jim. And, it doesn't matter that I was just a journeyman physio. You'd be like, he's the best. And just by saying that, you're increasing the chance of whatever I do in that initial contact is probably going to be increased, from just that one phrase of going, he's really good. And the patient doesn't necessarily know or feel that, but they've got a little bit more trust. And whether that means it's simply they do the exercises because they think you know what you're talking about, or whether it's just because they have trust in the process. I'm not sure of the actual, the modifying factor, but there is something about that definitely helps.
Interesting. So some of the big stuff that you've helped me understand with the body, kind of looking at different injuries. So maybe if we go into how you work, like what's your philosophy and how you kind of work through, say, like a soft tissue injury to begin with, and then we can look at maybe like what's the kind of process that you work through. Say somebody's got a soft tissue injury, so a hamstring or a calf, I guess are common ones, aren't they? What's your kind of process of working through those? Some things that I've understood have been super, super helpful. So I think people that are listening would probably really benefit from that as well. So say somebody comes in with a hamstring injury, what's your kind of process, your setup and design?
Yeah, so I think, again, I've probably changed over the years, and my philosophy is basically keep it as simple as you can. So first thing, make sure the hamstring you think is a hamstring is actually a hamstring with what tests you can do.
Yeah, so and adductor or
exactly, like, is it adductor, or is there a nerve issue that's going? Is there a referred pain? Is there something else going on? So I think first things, make sure it is what you think it is. Rule out anything nasty. That's always the case of a physiotherapist. Rule out anything red flag. Anything could be an issue that you'd want to take more seriously. And then from there,
what would that be? Sorry, just to jump in, what would something like a red flag? What would be jumping out, screaming at you?
A hamstring approach, generally, I would want to check the back. So neurological referral, is there a back injury? So depending on the area, is there like a dermatomal or referral from the back that might be masquerading as a hamstring injury? And that would be a very different treatment regime than it would be if it was just soft tissue.
Yeah, and I think that's something to be aware of, isn't it? Like for anybody listening, if you have got an injury, like from the things I've understood of this idea of thinking globally about it, like where you've got the site of pain or where you've got the injury, it might not necessarily be coming from there. And you have to be aware and open to that. I guess when you're in pain, it's very hard to become it's easy to become localized and focused on the particular area, but also you have to be aware that, I remember, I think it was Paul Check was saying about you have to think about injuries globally, like everything knocks onto something else. So it could be coming from below or above the site where you're actually getting the symptoms, I guess. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And previous injuries and those kind of things, I mean, they all play a role and sort of suggest or give you an idea of the likelihood of injury or how likely that person is going to get better. So definitely have to be aware of those things.
Cool. So rule out the red flags, then what do you move on to? What's the next step?
Make sure, like I said, you know it's a hamstring injury. And I'm a pretty basic person. I think there's probably more specific hamstring experts out there, but I can go, okay, if it's a hamstring injury, what can they do functionally? You know, can they squat? Can they lunge? How much can they move? I like to put a strength test on it. So use a dyno to see how much force they can put through. And that's kind of just not necessarily a pure indication of strength, an indicator of how happy their body is to generate force through that area. And that's a nice, again, if you can show a difference between the left and the right legs, that's a nice buy-in to say, hey, look, there's some work to do here before you're back to equal your other side and back to running and those kind of things.
I think it's really good. I guess it's the same as like you would have, this is what I've understood from it, is that it's the same in strength training, that you're basically on a micro level, you want to show improvement in the area. So say you've torn your hamstring and you start off with we used to do this, like you start off with a pain level or like a strength level of 2 or 3. And obviously what you're going to do is obviously you need somewhere to start. And then I guess then you're going to put a process in place. And then you want to see that the process that you put in place actually has some effect, some beneficial effect. And I guess it's the same as obviously with like pure strength training. You need to be able to measure it and you need a starting point, and that gives the athlete something to focus on, I guess, doesn't it? And it lets you know the work that you're going to do is actually having a beneficial effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good, I don't know how I used to do it prior to having, because I think I'm almost too reliant on handheld dynamometers now. So I think they're good from sort of showing the patient that, A, there is a problem, there's a lot of work to do. And it kind of gives them, like you said, a structured target to try and hit that as they kind of come in each consultation. And then you can base some decisions around there, like maybe you don't let them run until they're kind of at 80% strength of the other side, or depending on your criteria that you use. You can use those things to kind of dictate some return to play stuff as well. Like if they're really pushing the return to play and they're like, I feel really good, but you can show them on a handheld dynamometer, actually your strength is still a long way off. I'm not sure returning to high level at this stage would be such a good idea. You can kind of use it to make some decisions as well, which I think is kind of really helpful. And then it's a bit more objective rather than just going, you shouldn't do this. You can kind of show them some data and go, perhaps we should leave it a week or two until this is a bit stronger.
I guess what you're saying there is, I guess you've got a couple of things going on, isn't it? You've obviously you want to isolate the area to improve the capacity of the tissues to withstand load or volume. But also you've got the rest of the athlete who has got this 6-week period or a 4-week period where you're trying to keep them fit and trying to keep them ticking over. And obviously we've looked at a lot of this before, like with researchers, obviously, that training other areas of the body enhances the healing of the area that's actually injured as well. Obviously that's one of the big things I've kind of picked up from you and understood. So there's this idea, I guess it's like double prong, isn't it? I guess you're trying to fix the actual injury itself, but then also keep the athlete active and do as much as you can. So I guess you kind of got, maybe, do you think your strength conditioning background helped with that a little bit, I guess?
I think definitely, yeah. I think it helps a lot. I think you're exactly right. Like you have to take care of the individual, right? And if they're an athlete and they constantly used to running, and I mean that helps them maybe sleep and keep the stress going down, all those kind of things. I think those are the things that we kind of need to be aware of. So it's not just treating the hamstring, it's like treating the individual, make sure, psychologically they're still quite happy with what they're doing. They're the big issues. I mean, and then you can get really specific with hamstrings as well. But again, I think the evidence is always evolving. Like, you know, probably a couple of years ago, we didn't necessarily, the big thing was don't push through pain. And I think it was Jack Hickey. I'm going to misquote loads of people when I talk to you here, but there was an Australian guy that did some really interesting research to show that actually you can push people through a certain level of pain early days with a hamstring tear and get really good results. You know, and a couple of years ago, it was like, okay, don't go near pain. So this stuff is constantly evolving. And then in terms of loading it with different bias, so maybe you load a more hip or knee dominant, depending which hamstring you've torn. I mean, there's loads of stuff you can do. And this is the tricky bit of evidence-based practice, I think, because if you're constantly reading, which is a good thing, there's so many avenues you can get sort of more focused with your care. But again, I think that's where it's helpful to bring it back to the athlete involved and try and keep it as simple as you can. Like, what do they need to do? Okay, how do I get from A to B in the best way possible? Because, you know, I'm sure in 4 years' time, there'll be a better hamstring protocol that comes out that says, do this exercise and this is amazing for it. You know what I mean?
It's like the evidence is always updating. And I guess it's this idea that, like, I guess being a practitioner, you kind of put yourself out there. And one of the things you realize as you get more knowledgeable is you realize that obviously everything is continually changing, stuff is upgrading. And over time, things that you've done in the past might be the complete opposite to what you may do in the future, potentially, as the evidence changes. And I think like one of the big things that I've kind of also understood from like kind of the things that we've worked on in the past is this idea of like static, slow, and fast. And obviously, like the athlete at their best performance is them at their fastest, most powerful, isn't it? And it's like what most people do is when they get an injury, they try and jump straight from injury back to their fastest performance. And obviously, there's these levels of isometric exercises, slow exercises, and then fast exercises, and building them up, just like you would with your strength training program in terms of periodization throughout the season, going from slower stuff to faster activities. It's exactly the same kind of thing that like so many people jump. Like the reason why people re-injure particular parts of their body if they've had an injury there before is because they've missed out this gap in the middle. The static exercises, the slow stuff. I guess. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I know some physios like to work through like A. You must do A, then you must do B, then you must do C, which can get a bit boring if someone's at an amazing high level and you start them right back at ground zero. I just think what it means is you've got loads of variables you can play with, right? Like you could do 1,001 different exercises for the hamstring, but you can also load it 1,000 different ways. You know, you can fiddle with your strength parameters, you know, like 3 or 4 sets of 6 with a 2-minute break, or you could fiddle with your speed of contraction, or you can fiddle with pause. Like you can do so many different things. And I think the big thing in physio at the moment is, I think physio is definitely moving more towards the strength and conditioning stuff, right? People are trying to be more specific with their exercise prescription, which is awesome. And I think in certain injuries, that makes a lot of sense, like recovering from a hamstring or a calf, that makes loads of sense. But I think also too, we're trying to apply that across the board to other painful conditions. And I'm not sure that works the same way. I mean, there's other conditions that we have that where people are going, well, you've got to do a strength protocol and load it specifically. And you're like, well, do I? I mean, this person just has pain. I just need to get them doing something. You know, my mum has a rotator cuff issue, and she had all these weird things going on. And it's like any physio, like you're terrible at treating your family. And I was like, well, what hurts it? She's like, oh, lifting milk out of the fridge. I'm like, okay.
Poor mum.
So every time you go and get a tea, which from my mum's about 10 times a day, I want you to lift the milk 10 or 13 times with your elbow bent, so a short lever. And it took like 4 months for her to get better, but she got better, you know what I mean? Like there was no specific prescription. Yeah, maybe someone could have got her better a little bit faster, but I think for her that was enough to get her through the injury, and a little bit of advice that doesn't take too much time out of a day. So I think we can get carried away sometimes. Like specific populations, yep, perfect. But in other painful conditions, maybe we don't have to be so crazily specific.
I think that's the beauty of it. I've said this with quite a few people, and it's a reoccurring theme with people that have been on the show so far, is this idea that life is full of paradox, isn't it? Life is full of the opposing ends of the spectrum. So for certain parts of the population, they will need very specific, and there'll be systems and processes that will basically, you can tick the boxes and you'll get them from injured back to full working mode. And on the complete flip side of that, there'll be people that will just need rub and a pat and to be told that they're okay and kind of move in the right direction. And I guess your job, and this is what I'm realizing as a practitioner, anybody who's a practitioner out there, is that you have to be you have to have your eyes open to be able to look at what's in front of you and to recognize what's actually required. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I 100% agree, because exactly as you say, otherwise I think you end up doing very similar stuff for everyone, which is not a good thing to do. And I try and, I don't always do this. If it's a busy week, this doesn't happen, but on a slower week, I try and think, all right, have I given a few people the same conditions, similar stuff? And was it appropriate, or was I just churning out the same crap because I was a bit lazy mentally, and I know it's worked before, and if I start doing that, I go, all right, that's not great. Like if I've churned out the same program 2 or 3 times in a week, like I don't see why I necessarily should be doing that, so I kind of give myself a bit of a slap on the wrist and go, okay, no, next week, maybe listen a little bit more, figure out what they actually want to do rather than prescribing the same old tired junk.
I guess it's like your state. I've seen this, the literature shows that like judges give parole more successfully in the mornings, isn't it? Like when they're fresher and energy levels and willpower and motivation is higher. And I guess as practitioners, we have to organize our diaries in a way, in an idealistic world, it would be great to organize your diary so that you only see the people fresh when your motivation levels are high in the morning. I guess that would be the optimal, but
100%. Yeah, I read the same study the other day because I was doing some uni stuff. Yeah, it was like prior to their lunch breaks, they're at the worst, and just after lunch breaks, right, the decisions are much more favourable to the person sitting in front of them. But yeah, it's so true. And I would love to sit on another couple of physios. I need to probably do it more, right, to see how they handle it, because I think if you've got a busy clinical diary, I'm not sure how some people stay at 100% for the whole time. Like, sounds really bad, but I think if you've got, a busy day, 10 plus patients, it's pretty difficult, depending on what they're presenting with, to stay 100%, there and present for those 10 plus people a day. Like sometimes you're just drained.
Definitely agree.
I don't know if the model lends itself to being absolutely perfect, you know what I mean? Because it's this in private practice, you're getting paid per consultation. I don't know how that works in terms of kind of getting better. They're kind of at opposing ends.
This is a whole separate conversation, I guess, isn't it? That looking at how do you, like, it's an art, it's a canvas. You've got every person that comes in, you've got the science that you have in your head, and you're then trying to take that science and apply it to the individual. It's like a painting. You've got different brush strokes and different colors that you can use for every person. And I guess if you're drained, like exactly like you said, if you're drained, it's kind of, are you really delivering your best work? I've completely understand that. I can understand it's not easy. So other practitioners will understand that as well, I guess. I don't want to take too much of your time, buddy, because I know that you've got to shoot off. So we'll get you back on. I obviously want to delve into some more of the some more mindset stuff. I want to talk about more of the elite athlete performance, but it'd be good just to finish off with like what current stuff, what stuff are you reading at the minute?
I'm basically reading loads about lower back pain, because that's kind of where as we're sort of having a chat off air, that's kind of what I'm doing for my master's research stuff at the moment. So we're trying to look into, there's a big push in lower back pain care to basically demedicalize it, right? For someone that comes in with what we now term non-specific lower back pain, just meaning we don't necessarily know what the pain source is, but we think we can probably get them better regardless without knowing that. What are the outcomes if you say see a chiro or a physio versus say if your first consultation is with a doctor or a surgeon? So I'm just trying to look at some scoping review stuff around that at the moment. So I'm just reading all about back pain basically.
What are you finding currently? What's your general hunch?
I mean, it's tricky, right? Because it depends on the way and the methodology of the studies. But I mean, the thought process is that maybe, people, non-medicalized care, which is like your physio, your chiro, your osteos, probably can deliver equivalent care to like a doctor, as in the first consultation, but we're probably less likely to prescribe medications and do imaging, depending on where you are, probably because we don't have the rights for prescribing, depending which country you work in, and you probably don't get rebates in your imaging. So immediately you've got two barriers to deliver certain healthcare things, which we know can affect the person's outcome. So if early opioid prescription and imaging, depending on the patient, can actually, or is associated with worse outcomes. So I'm not sure it's like an osteo or a physio or a chiro is better. It's just that we don't necessarily have access to those things, so we don't use them. And maybe that affects the patient's journey. That's kind of what I'm interested in, is if the patient comes in, depending on who they see and where they're at, whether they come into emergency care for back pain or where they come to primary care or, I don't know, a private clinic down the road, how does their journey look like through the process and what things influence them as well? You know, it's more than just what they come in with. You know, it might depend on who they see when they first go in. You know, someone might really, you know, exacerbate their fear of their back, and then maybe that changes their journey. Or someone might do the opposite and calm them down and give them confidence, and they end up going in a much different route through their journey.
And I guess that's all down to the practitioner and the tools that they think that they have available to them. I know that, like, my experience in the past, there's been doctors who have told me things, and then you see a different person and they tell you something completely different, obviously depending on the lens in which their skill set, what they've been taught, how up to date with with the information they've stayed with. Sorry, that doesn't make any sense, but these like how up to date their knowledge base is, I guess. And
I saw you ask, I don't know, it was an osteopath you had on a few weeks ago, was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you said sort of what's the difference between osteo, physio, and chiro, and I think you learn different philosophies when you're at university, but at the end of the day, if you're reading the same literature, all the osteos and chiropractors that I've met that are reading the same stuff as me work pretty similarly. You know, I think we might start a bit differently. We all end up funneling in, and we're not too different. I don't know if, you know, people go, what's the difference between osteo, chiro, and physio? I think up-to-date practitioners are pretty similar, to be honest with you. I don't think that there's a name difference, but the delivery and the service, I think, is pretty similar.
Yeah,
I think there's too much of a divide out there to go, oh, you see a chiro for this or you see an osteo for that. I think bollocks. It's just see who you get along with, that you've got confidence in, and if they're up to date, they're probably going to deliver similar interventions anyway, most of the time. That's what I think anyway. That's my experience.
Awesome. You've got a wealth of experience, so no, I really appreciate you, Jim. Thanks for coming on, buddy. Guys, if you like the episode, then hit the like button for us, as it helps us with the YouTube algorithm, and also hit subscribe and the notification bell, so when we get Jim back on, you'll be able to keep up to date with the evidence and literature and all of his wealth of knowledge and experience. Jim, really appreciate you coming on, buddy.
No problem. Been brilliant.
Speak to you soon.
See you, mate.